My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 26 years old. 3 weeks ago, I walked down the aisle at my wedding with the most unexpected date of my life. Not my father, who should have been there to give me away. Not my stepfather, who tried to fill that role. But Marcus Whitman, my stepmother's ex-husband, the man she left my father for, only to abandon him 2 years later for someone else entirely. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The look of absolute horror on Victoria's face when she saw us together was worth every whispered conversation and raised eyebrow in that church. Growing up in Millbrook, a quiet suburb just outside Portland, I thought I understood what family meant. My mother, Jennifer, had been the heart of our home until cancer took her when I was 14. Those were the golden years, when Sunday mornings meant pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse ears, and evenings were filled with her reading stories in different voices that made my younger brother Tommy and me dissolve into giggles. She had this way of making even the most ordinary Tuesday feel magical, turning grocery shopping into treasure hunts and rainy days into indoor camping adventures. Dad seemed lost without her, wandering through our house like a ghost haunting rooms that still smelled faintly of her lavender perfume. David Mitchell had always been the quieter parent, content to let Mom take the lead in most family decisions while he provided steady support from the sidelines. He worked as an engineer for a local manufacturing company, spending long hours at the office designing systems and processes that most people would find tediously boring, but that he approached with genuine passion. Before Mom died, his predictable routine had been comforting. Now it felt hollow. For 2 years after the funeral, it was just the three of us trying to figure out how to be a family without our center. Dad attempted to fill Mom's shoes, burning countless dinners and shrinking our clothes in the washing machine. Tommy, who was only 12 when we lost her, became increasingly withdrawn, spending hours in his room playing video games or reading comic books. I tried to step into a motherly role that felt too big for my 16-year-old shoulders, packing lunches and helping with homework while grieving my own loss. The house felt too quiet without Mom's laughter echoing through the hallways. Her garden withered in the backyard because none of us knew how to tend the roses she had loved so much. Dad would sometimes stand at the kitchen window staring at those dying flowers, his coffee growing cold in his hands. We were all drowning in our grief, each of us isolated on our own little islands of sorrow. Then Victoria Lancaster entered our lives like a whirlwind wrapped in designer clothes and expensive perfume. She was everything my mother hadn't been. Where Mom had been soft and nurturing, Victoria was sharp and ambitious. Where Mom had worn comfortable jeans and oversized sweaters, Victoria favored tailored suits and heels that clicked authoritatively across our hardwood floors. She was a real estate agent who specialized in luxury properties, successful and confident in ways that seemed to both intimidate and fascinate my father. They met at a grief counseling group that Dad had reluctantly joined after his sister practically dragged him there. Victoria had lost her first husband in a car accident 3 years earlier, leaving her to raise her twin daughters alone. She spoke about loss with a clinical detachment that Dad mistook for strength, never realizing that her emotional distance wasn't healing, but rather a wall she'd built to protect herself from ever feeling that vulnerable again. Their courtship moved with a speed that left Tommy and me reeling. 6 months after their first coffee date, she was spending most nights at our house. A year later, Dad proposed with a ring that cost more than our car. Victoria accepted with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, already mentally redecorating our home and planning the elaborate wedding she claimed she'd always dreamed of having. I should have seen the warning signs earlier, but at 18, I was focused on my senior year of high school and college applications. The small changes seemed insignificant at first. Victoria would rearrange Mom's books on the shelves, claiming she was just trying to help organize things better. She replaced Mom's cheerful yellow curtains in the kitchen with stark white ones that let in harsh light. The comfortable mismatched furniture that Mom had collected over years was gradually replaced with matching sets that looked like they belonged in a furniture showroom rather than a family home. More troubling were the subtle ways Victoria began, isolating Dad from his old friends and routines. She convinced him to skip his monthly poker night with college buddies, arguing that they were holding him back from moving forward with his life. She suggested he find a new barber because his longtime guy was too far away and wasn't professional enough for someone in his position. One by one, the connections that had anchored Dad to his life before and during his marriage to my mother were severed. Victoria's daughters, Melissa and Amanda, were my age, but attended private school across town. They visited every other weekend and seemed pleasant enough in a superficial way, always polite but never warm. They called Dad by his first name and treated our house like a hotel they were temporarily staying in rather than a second home. Victoria never encouraged them to bond with Tommy and me, and we gradually learned not to expect more than civil pleasantries during their visits. The wedding took place on a crisp October afternoon at the country club where Victoria was a member. She had planned every detail with military precision, from the imported flowers to the 7-course dinner that featured cuisine Tommy and I couldn't even pronounce. Dad looked handsome in his tuxedo, but somehow smaller than I remembered, as if he were playing a role that didn't quite fit. Victoria was radiant in a dress that probably cost more than Dad's monthly salary, accepting congratulations with practiced grace. I wore the bridesmaid dress Victoria had selected, a pale pink confection that made me look washed out and younger than my 18 years. Tommy, uncomfortable in his first real suit, stood beside Dad looking like he wanted to bolt from the ceremony entirely. We smiled for the professional photographer Victoria had hired, but something felt fundamentally wrong about the whole celebration. This wasn't the intimate, joyful gathering my parents' wedding photos had captured. This was a performance, and we were all just supporting players in Victoria's carefully orchestrated production. The honeymoon took them to Italy for 3 weeks, leaving Tommy and me alone in a house that was already beginning to feel foreign. When they returned, the changes accelerated. Victoria announced that she would be moving in permanently, bringing with her enough furniture and belongings to transform our home completely. Mom's photos were relegated to a single shelf in the hallway, replaced by Victoria's extensive collection of abstract art that none of us understood or particularly liked. The kitchen, which had been the heart of our family life when Mom was alive, became Victoria's domain. She hired a housekeeper to maintain her standards of cleanliness and organization, and suddenly Tommy and I felt like guests in our own home. We were expected to remove our shoes at the door, keep our voices down during Victoria's important phone calls, and ask permission before accessing certain areas of the house that she considered her private space. Dad seemed oblivious to how uncomfortable his children had become in their own home. He was so grateful to have someone taking charge, making decisions, and filling the silence that had haunted our house for years, that he didn't notice how that same efficiency was squeezing the life out of what remained of our family dynamic. Victoria ran our household like a business, with schedules and rules and consequences that felt nothing like the warm chaos Mom had embraced. My senior year became a countdown to escape. I threw myself into my studies and college applications, spending long hours at the public library to avoid the tension at home. Tommy retreated even further into his shell, barely speaking during family dinners that had become formal affairs conducted in Victoria's dining room rather than the casual kitchen table gatherings we'd grown up with. The easy banter, and inside, jokes that had once characterized our family meals were replaced by polite conversation about Victoria's real estate deals and Dad's work projects. Victoria made it clear from the beginning that she had no interest in being a mother figure to Tommy and me. She wasn't cruel, but she wasn't nurturing either. We were simply obstacles to be managed rather than children to be loved. She never attended my school events, never asked about my friends or my plans for the future, never showed any curiosity about who I was becoming as a young woman. Her own daughters remained her priority during their weekend visits. while Tommy and I learned to make ourselves invisible to avoid disrupting her carefully maintained order. The final straw came during the spring of my senior year, when I was accepted to Oregon State University with a partial scholarship. I was thrilled about the opportunity to study journalism and finally have the chance to live on campus like a normal college student. But when I shared the news with Dad and Victoria over dinner, her reaction was immediate and dismissive. She pointed out that the partial scholarship still left a significant amount of tuition and living expenses uncovered. Dad would need to take out loans or use his savings, money that she felt would be better invested in their future together. She suggested I consider the local community college instead, where I could live at home and work part-time to help with expenses. The look on Dad's face told me he was already considering her practical arguments, weighing his daughter's dreams against his new wife's financial concerns. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my bedroom, which was one of the few spaces in the house that Victoria hadn't completely transformed. My acceptance letter sat on my desk like a ticket to freedom, but I could already feel that opportunity slipping away. Dad had always been a practical man who made decisions based on logic rather than emotion. Victoria's influence was simply giving him permission to choose the path of least resistance, even if it meant disappointing his daughter. The conversation about college became a series of increasingly uncomfortable family meetings, where Victoria outlined various compromise options, each one involving me staying home and scaling back my ambitions to fit their budget and convenience. Dad nodded along with her suggestions, occasionally glancing at me with what might have been regret, but never quite managing to stand up for my original plans. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tommy watched these discussions with growing anger. Old enough to understand that his sister was being sacrificed for his stepmother's comfort, but too young to know how to intervene effectively. I realized that in Dad's grief and gratitude for Victoria's presence in his life, he had lost sight of his responsibilities to the children who had been there all along. We had become inconvenient reminders of his previous life, obstacles to the fresh start Victoria represented. She never explicitly asked him to choose between her and us, but her disapproval of anything that didn't serve her interests was clear enough that Dad learned to anticipate and avoid her displeasure. The house that had once echoed with laughter and sibling arguments became a place where Tommy and I moved quietly through our routines, trying not to disturb the artificial peace Victoria had imposed. We developed a silent communication system, exchanging looks across the dinner table that conveyed volumes about our shared understanding of how dramatically our lives had changed. We were both counting down the days until we could leave, though Tommy still had years of high school ahead of him. My 18th birthday arrived with little fanfare. Victoria had arranged a small dinner at an expensive restaurant, the kind of place where the portions were tiny and the atmosphere was formal. Dad gave me a necklace he'd clearly selected with Victoria's input, something tasteful and adult that bore no resemblance to the quirky personal gifts Mom used to choose. Tommy had saved his allowance to buy me a book by my favorite author, a gesture that meant more than any expensive jewelry because it showed he actually knew and cared about my interests. As we sat in that restaurant, making polite conversation about my plans for college that were still unresolved, I felt like I was watching my family from a great distance. These people at the table looked familiar, but the relationships between us had been fundamentally altered by Victoria's presence. Dad was trying to be celebratory while avoiding any topic that might lead to conflict with his wife. Victoria was performing the role of caring stepmother while making it clear that this celebration was an obligation rather than a joy. Tommy was quiet and watchful, already learning to protect himself by revealing as little as possible. After dinner, as we drove home through the familiar streets of my childhood, I made a decision that surprised even me. I was going to Oregon State University, regardless of whether Dad was willing to support me financially. I would take out student loans, work multiple jobs, apply for every scholarship and grant available, whatever it took to claim my independence. I wasn't going to let Victoria's priorities dictate the direction of my life. and I wasn't going to wait for Dad to remember that his daughter's future mattered too. That night, I called my Aunt Rebecca, Mom's younger sister who lived in Seattle. She had remained close to Tommy and me after Mom's death, though her relationship with Dad had become strained since his remarriage. Rebecca had never liked Victoria, sensing immediately that this woman had no real interest in preserving Mom's memory or maintaining connections with the people who had loved her. Their few interactions had been politely hostile, with Victoria making it clear that she preferred to limit Tommy's and my contact with Mom's side of the family. Rebecca listened without interruption as I explained my college situation and my determination to find a way to attend Oregon State, regardless of Dad's financial support. Her response was immediate and generous. She offered to help with whatever I needed, whether that was money for applications, a place to stay during school breaks, or simply someone to talk to when the pressure became overwhelming. For the first time in months, I felt like someone was truly on my side, supporting my dreams rather than trying to reshape them to fit their convenience. The rest of my senior year passed in a blur of scholarship applications, financial aid paperwork, and part-time job hunting. I worked at the local bookstore after school and on weekends, saving every penny for college expenses while watching my classmates enjoy the typical freedoms of their final year of high school. Victoria seemed relieved that I was taking responsibility for my own future, though she occasionally made comments about young people learning the value of hard work and independence. Dad's attitude was harder to read. Sometimes I caught him watching me with something that might have been pride as I balanced work and school responsibilities. Other times, he seemed almost resentful, as if my determination to pursue my original plans was a criticism of his failure to support them. He never directly addressed the tension between us, but the easy relationship we'd maintained even through our grief was clearly strained by the unspoken conflict over my future. Tommy began, spending more time at friends' houses, instinctively understanding that our home was no longer a place where he could relax and be himself. Victoria's standards for behavior and appearance were exhausting for a 14-year-old boy who just wanted to play video games and eat cereal for dinner sometimes. She frequently criticized his table manners, his choice of clothes, and his general lack of what she considered sophistication. Dad rarely intervened in these corrections, leaving Tommy to navigate Victoria's expectations without support or guidance. The transformation of our family dynamic accelerated as graduation approached. Victoria began making plans for my bedroom, discussing with Dad how they might convert it into a home office or guest room once I left for college. The casual way she talked about erasing my presence from the house made it clear that she viewed my departure as a permanent severing of ties rather than the normal progression of a young adult leaving home for education. Dad didn't object to these conversations, and his silence felt like another small betrayal. My graduation ceremony arrived with mixed emotions. I was proud of my academic achievements and excited about starting college in the fall. But the day felt incomplete without Mom there to celebrate with me. Dad and Victoria attended, along with Aunt Rebecca, who had driven down from Seattle specifically for the occasion. The contrast between their reactions was stark. Dad seemed genuinely proud but somewhat distant, as if he were congratulating someone else's daughter. Victoria was politely supportive, but clearly ready for the ceremony to end so she could move on to other obligations. Rebecca was openly emotional, taking dozens of photos and expressing the kind of maternal pride that I desperately missed. After the ceremony, we had lunch at a restaurant that Dad had chosen, someplace nice but not too expensive. Victoria spent most of the meal on her phone dealing with what she claimed was a real estate emergency, leaving the rest of us to make awkward conversation about my college plans and Tommy's upcoming freshman year of high school. Rebecca asked pointed questions about our living situation and future plans that made Dad uncomfortable and Victoria defensive. The tension was obvious to everyone at the table, though no one addressed it directly. As summer began, I worked full-time at the bookstore while finalizing my preparations for college. I had cobbled together enough financial aid, scholarships, and student loans to cover my expenses, though it would mean graduating with significant debt. The accomplishment felt hollow because I had achieved it despite my family's support rather than because of it. Dad occasionally asked about my preparations, but his questions felt obligatory rather than genuinely interested. Victoria had already begun treating me like a guest who was overstaying her welcome. The physical changes to our house continued throughout the summer. Mom's garden was completely redesigned according to Victoria's preferences, with the wild, colorful flowers Mom had loved replaced by geometric arrangements of expensive plants that required professional maintenance. The comfortable, lived-in feeling that had made our house a home was systematically eliminated in favor of a showplace that reflected Victoria's taste and status. Tommy and I spent increasing amounts of time away from home, meeting at the local park or coffee shop to actually talk to each other without feeling like we were being monitored or judged. He confided his fears about starting high school while living under Victoria's increasingly rigid rules. I shared my excitement about college mixed with guilt about leaving him alone to navigate the family dynamics that had become so toxic. We both understood that my departure would make his situation more difficult, but neither of us could see any alternative. 2 weeks before I was scheduled to leave for Oregon State, Dad approached me with what he presented as a final attempt at compromise. He had been talking with Victoria about my college plans, and they had decided they could provide some financial support if I agreed to attend the local community college for my first 2 years and continue living at home. I could transfer to a 4-year university later, once they had a better understanding of their financial situation and long-term plans. The offer was presented as generous, but I recognized it for what it really was. Victoria's last attempt to maintain control over my choices while appearing reasonable to Dad. Living at home for 2 more years would mean continuing to navigate her rules and expectations while watching my high school friends move on with their lives. The local community college was a fine institution, but it wasn't what I had worked toward or what would best serve my career goals in journalism. I declined the offer as politely as I could, explaining that I had already committed to Oregon State and arranged my financial aid package. Dad's disappointment was obvious, though I suspected it had more to do with the conflict my decision would create with Victoria than with genuine concern for my welfare. Victoria's reaction was cooler, a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she viewed my refusal as both ungrateful and disrespectful. That evening, I overheard them discussing my decision in their bedroom, their voices carrying through the thin walls of our house. Victoria was explaining to Dad how my stubbornness and ingratitude reflected poorly on his parenting, how my determination to pursue my own path, regardless of family financial constraints, showed a selfishness that would only get worse if it wasn't corrected. Dad's responses were defensive but weak, more focused on avoiding conflict with his wife than on standing up for his daughter's right to make her own choices. The conversation confirmed what I had suspected for months. In Victoria's view, Tommy and I were obstacles to the life she wanted to build with Dad. Our needs, our dreams, our very presence in the house were inconveniences to be managed rather than important considerations in family decisions. Dad had either convinced himself that Victoria's approach was practical and reasonable, or he was too emotionally dependent on her to risk challenging her perspective. My last night in the family home was quiet and strange. I had packed everything. I owned into 2 suitcases and a few boxes, leaving behind only the furniture and decorations that had never really felt like mine anyway. Tommy helped me load my car in the early morning darkness, both of us crying without really talking about why. We hugged goodbye in the driveway, promising to stay in close touch despite the distance and family tensions. Dad emerged from the house as I was starting my car, still in his pajamas and looking older than I remembered. He handed me an envelope that contained a check for $500 and a note expressing his love and best wishes for my success in college. The gesture felt both generous and inadequate, a last-minute attempt to ease his conscience about letting me leave without the support I had needed. Victoria remained inside, claiming she didn't want to interfere with our private goodbye, but clearly having no emotional investment in my departure. As I drove away from Millbrook that morning, Watching my childhood home shrink in the rearview mirror, I felt a complicated mixture of relief and grief. I was finally free to pursue my own path without constantly navigating Victoria's disapproval and Dad's passive enabling of her behavior. But I was also leaving behind Tommy, who would now bear the full weight of Victoria's attention and expectations, without the buffer of my presence to share the burden. College life at Oregon State was everything I had hoped it would be and more. I threw myself into my journalism classes, working harder than most of my classmates, because I understood the sacrifices that had made my education possible. I worked 20 hours a week at the campus newspaper and took on freelance writing assignments to help cover my living expenses. The independence was intoxicating after years of feeling like a guest in my own home. My relationship with Dad became a series of brief, superficial phone calls and carefully worded emails. He would ask about my classes and grades, but never about my emotional well-being or whether I was happy with my choice. I suspected Victoria monitored our communications, either directly or by creating an atmosphere where Dad felt he needed to be careful about showing too much interest in my life away from home. Our conversations felt scripted and distant, lacking the warmth and intimacy that had characterized our relationship before his remarriage. Tommy's situation deteriorated significantly during my freshman year. Without my presence to serve as a buffer, Victoria's attention focused entirely on molding him into her idea of an appropriate stepson. She enrolled him in expensive private tutoring to improve his grades, signed him up for tennis lessons at her country club despite his complete lack of interest in the sport, and began a campaign to change everything from his haircut to his choice of friends. He called me late at night when he was sure Victoria and Dad were asleep, sharing stories of increasing restrictions and criticisms that made my heart ache. Victoria had implemented a point system for household behavior, where Tommy could earn or lose privileges based on his compliance with her expectations. Dad went along with this system, apparently convinced that structure and discipline were exactly what his son needed to become successful and well-adjusted. The few times I came home for brief visits during my freshman year, the tension in the house was palpable. Victoria treated me with polite coolness, asking superficial questions about college while making it clear that she considered my presence disruptive to the routine she had established. Dad seemed nervous during these visits, torn between wanting to reconnect with his daughter and needing to maintain peace with his wife. Tommy was a shadow of his former self, carefully polite and unnaturally quiet, clearly walking on eggshells to avoid triggering Victoria's disapproval. During my sophomore year, I learned that Victoria had been married once before her first husband died in the car accident. She had been married to Marcus Whitman for 3 years, and their divorce had been finalized just 6 months before she met Dad. The information came from Aunt Rebecca, who had done some investigative research after becoming increasingly concerned about Victoria's influence over Dad and her treatment of Tommy and me. Marcus, according to Rebecca's findings, was a successful architect who lived about an hour away in the affluent suburb of West Hills. He was 42 years old, had no children of his own, and had apparently been devastated when Victoria left him for another man. She had moved out of their shared home one weekend while he was traveling for work, leaving only a brief note explaining that she had fallen in love with someone else and wanted a divorce as quickly as possible. The someone else, it turned out, was a wealthy real estate developer named Charles Brennan, who was married to someone else at the time. Victoria's affair with Charles had lasted about 8 months before he decided not to leave his wife after all, leaving Victoria alone and financially stressed. She had met Dad just a few weeks after Charles ended their relationship, which explained the speed with which she had pursued and secured their marriage. This information painted Victoria's relationship with Dad in a completely different light. Rather than the grieving widow finding love again that she had presented herself as, she was actually a woman who had a pattern of using relationships for financial and social security. Dad wasn't her great love. He was her backup plan after her preferred option had fallen through. I debated whether to share this information with Dad, knowing that it would destroy his understanding of his marriage and probably create a crisis that would affect Tommy more than anyone else. In the end, I decided that Dad was an adult who had made his choices, and my priority needed to be supporting Tommy through the increasingly difficult situation at home, rather than trying to save Dad from his own decisions. By my junior year, Tommy's academic performance had declined significantly despite Victoria's expensive tutoring and rigid study schedules. He was struggling with anxiety and depression, symptoms that Victoria attributed to teenage moodiness and lack of discipline, rather than recognizing as responses to the emotional stress he was experiencing. Dad seemed oblivious to his son's deteriorating mental health, focused on his work and his marriage while trusting Victoria to handle all domestic concerns. Tommy began talking about wanting to move in with Aunt Rebecca in Seattle, though he was afraid to broach the subject with Dad because it would require acknowledging that his home life had become unbearable. I encouraged him to have this conversation, knowing that Rebecca would welcome him and provide the emotional support he desperately needed. But Tommy was only 16 and still hoped that things would somehow improve if he could just figure out how to meet Victoria's expectations. The crisis came during the spring of my junior year, when Tommy was caught cheating on a major history exam. The incident was completely out of character for him, but the pressure to maintain perfect grades while dealing with Victoria's constant criticism had pushed him past his breaking point. The school contacted Dad and Victoria, recommending family counseling and suggesting that Tommy might benefit from a reduced academic load and more emotional support at home. Victoria's response was swift and harsh. She blamed Tommy's behavior on his poor character and lack of proper guidance, arguing that what he needed was more discipline rather than therapy or reduced expectations. She convinced Dad that counseling would be a waste of money and that giving Tommy any slack would only encourage further irresponsible behavior. Instead, she implemented even stricter rules and consequences, treating the cheating incident as evidence that her previous approach hadn't been tough enough. Tommy called me that night, sobbing into the phone as he described the confrontation with Victoria and Dad's passive support of her position. He felt completely trapped and hopeless, unable to meet expectations that seemed designed to ensure his failure. I made the decision that night to drive home the following weekend, regardless of whether I was welcome, to have a direct conversation with Dad about what was happening to his son. The confrontation with Dad and Victoria was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I presented my concerns about Tommy's emotional well-being and the unrealistic pressures being placed on him, backed up by specific examples of Victoria's treatment and Dad's failure to protect his son. Victoria responded with cold fury, accusing me of interfering in their family business and undermining their authority over Tommy. Dad was caught between his daughter's obvious concern and his wife's outrage, ultimately siding with Victoria by asking me to leave and not return, unless I was prepared to respect their household rules. That night changed everything between us. I realized that Dad had made his choice, and it wasn't his children. Victoria had successfully convinced him that Tommy and I were the problems, that our resistance to her authority was what was causing the family dysfunction. He was too emotionally dependent on her and too invested in their relationship to acknowledge that his wife was systematically destroying his relationships with his children. I helped Tommy move in with Aunt Rebecca that summer, despite Dad's initial threats about custody and parental rights. Faced with the reality that his 16-year-old son was desperate enough to leave home rather than continue living under Victoria's rule, Dad ultimately agreed to let Tommy finish high school in Seattle. Victoria seemed relieved to have one, less obstacle to her control, though she framed Tommy's departure as evidence of his inability to handle structure and responsibility. My senior year of college was marked by increasing distance from Dad and increasing closeness with Tommy and Aunt Rebecca. We formed our own little family unit, bound together by our shared understanding of what we had lost and our determination to support each other despite the wreckage of our original family. Dad's occasional calls became increasingly stilted and infrequent, usually prompted by guilt rather than genuine desire to connect. It was during my final semester that I met Marcus Whitman for the first time, though the meeting was entirely accidental. I was interviewing local business leaders for my senior thesis project on economic development in small Oregon communities. Marcus's architectural firm had designed several important buildings in the area, and he had been recommended as someone who could provide valuable insights into the relationship between urban planning and community growth. The interview was conducted at his firm's offices in West Hills, a sleek modern building that showcased his design aesthetic and professional success. Marcus was nothing like what I had expected based on my preconceptions about the kind of man Victoria would marry. He was tall and distinguished-looking, with graying temples and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see everything. But more than his physical appearance, what struck me was his warmth and genuine interest in my project. He spoke thoughtfully about architecture's role in creating communities, about the responsibility designers had to consider how their work would affect the people who lived and worked in the spaces they created. His passion for his profession was evident, but so was his understanding of its broader social implications. This was a man who thought deeply about his impact on the world, the opposite of the shallow opportunist I had expected Victoria's ex-husband to be. As our interview concluded, Marcus mentioned that he had recognized my last name and wondered if I might be related to David Mitchell, who lived in Millbrook. When I confirmed that David was my father, Marcus's expression grew carefully neutral, and he simply said that he hoped my family was doing well. The conversation ended politely, but with an underlying tension that suggested there was much more to the story than either of us was willing to discuss in that setting. I left that interview with a completely different understanding of Victoria's first marriage and its demise. Marcus Whitman was clearly a good man who had been genuinely hurt by his wife's betrayal. The contrast between his thoughtful professionalism and Victoria's calculated manipulation was stark, and I found myself wondering what their marriage had really been like and why she had been willing to throw it away. That night, I called Aunt Rebecca to share my unexpected encounter with Marcus. She was fascinated by my description of the meeting and my impression of him as someone completely different from what we had expected. Rebecca had been doing her own research into Victoria's background, and she shared some additional information she had uncovered about the divorce and its aftermath. According to court documents that Rebecca had accessed, Victoria had tried to claim spousal support from Marcus, despite being the one who had left the marriage for another man. She had argued that she had given up her own career opportunities to support his business development, though the evidence suggested she had actually benefited significantly from his connections and success in building her real estate practice. Marcus had ultimately agreed to a modest settlement just to end the proceedings quickly and avoid further public attention. The picture that emerged was of a woman who viewed marriage as a business arrangement rather than an emotional partnership. Victoria had apparently calculated that Marcus's steady but unspectacular income as an architect was less appealing than Charles Brennan's wealth and social status. When that relationship failed to provide the security she had expected, she had quickly moved on to Dad, who represented another form of stability, even if he couldn't provide the luxury lifestyle she preferred. This information crystallized something I had been struggling to understand about Dad's marriage. Victoria hadn't fallen in love with him. She had selected him as the best available option for meeting her needs. His grief and loneliness had made him an easy target for someone who knew how to present herself as the solution to all his problems. She had never intended to be a mother to Tommy and me because we represented obligations that interfered with her primary goal of securing her own future. As I prepared to graduate from college and begin my career in journalism, I found myself thinking more and more about the injustices that Victoria had perpetrated against our family and the way Dad had enabled her behavior through his weakness and selfishness. Tommy was thriving in Seattle under Aunt Rebecca's care, but the damage to his relationship with Dad seemed permanent. Our family had been destroyed not by tragedy or unavoidable circumstances, but by one person's calculated selfishness and another person's willingness to sacrifice his children's welfare for his own comfort. graduation day arrived with mixed emotions. I was proud of my academic achievements and excited about the job I had secured at a newspaper in Eugene, but the absence of my father at such an important milestone felt like a fresh wound. Tommy and Aunt Rebecca made the trip from Seattle to celebrate with me, and their presence helped fill some of the emptiness left by Dad's absence. He had sent a card with a check inside, a gesture that felt more obligatory than loving. That summer, as I settled into my new apartment and began my journalism career, I made a decision that surprised even me. I was going to get back in touch with Marcus Whitman, not for any romantic reasons, but because I was curious about his perspective on Victoria and her impact on the people who had the misfortune to become involved with her. I also felt that he might be someone who could understand the particular pain of being betrayed by someone you had trusted completely. 3 months into my journalism career at the Eugene Register, I found myself thinking about Marcus Whitman more often than I cared to admit. The brief interview we had conducted for my senior thesis had left me with questions that professional curiosity couldn't entirely explain. There was something about his measured responses and careful neutrality. When I mentioned my family name that suggested depths of experience I wanted to understand better. My apartment in Eugene was a modest one-bedroom place in an older building near downtown. Nothing fancy but sufficient for a recent graduate starting her career. The walls were bare except for a few framed photos of Tommy and Aunt Rebecca. Deliberate. Reminders of the family connections that actually mattered to me. I had chosen not to display any pictures of Dad or our fractured family gatherings, unwilling to pretend that those relationships held the same meaning they once had. Work provided a welcome distraction from family drama. The newspaper assigned me primarily to local government meetings and community events, the kind of foundational reporting that taught young journalists how to find stories in seemingly mundane proceedings. I covered city council debates about zoning ordinances and school board discussions about budget allocations, learning to identify the human interests that lay beneath bureaucratic language and political maneuvering. My editor, Patricia Holbrook, was a veteran journalist in her 50s who had built her career covering state politics before moving to Eugene to focus on community journalism. She took a particular interest in my development, perhaps recognizing something of her younger self in my determination to prove myself through hard work and attention to detail. Patricia had a reputation for being demanding but fair, expecting her reporters to dig deeper than surface-level coverage and find the stories that truly mattered to readers. One afternoon in late August, Patricia assigned me to cover a public hearing about a proposed waterfront development project that had divided the community for months. The project involved converting an old warehouse district into a mixed-use complex, featuring upscale condominiums, retail spaces, and office buildings. Supporters argued it would bring jobs and tax revenue to the area, while opponents worried about gentrification and the displacement of longtime residents and businesses. I arrived at City Hall early to review the planning documents and speak with key stakeholders before the hearing began. The developers' presentation materials were impressive, featuring architectural renderings that showed gleaming buildings surrounded by landscaped parks and bustling pedestrian areas. The financial projections promised significant economic benefits for the city, including hundreds of construction jobs and millions in annual tax revenue once the project was completed. As I studied the architectural plans more closely, I noticed the firm's logo in the corner of each page. Whitman Associates, with an address in West Hills that I recognized immediately. Marcus Whitman was the architect behind this controversial project, which meant he would likely be present at the hearing to present his designs and answer questions from the Planning Commission and concerned citizens. The hearing room filled quickly as the start time approached. I recognized several familiar faces from previous city council meetings, including longtime residents who frequently spoke during public comment periods, and local business owners who stayed informed about municipal decisions that might affect their operations. The atmosphere was tense, with supporters and opponents sitting in distinct groups that barely acknowledged each other's presence. Marcus entered the hearing room about 10 minutes before the proceedings began, carrying a portfolio of materials and accompanied by the project developer, a businessman named Robert Chen, whom I had interviewed previously about other commercial developments in the area. Marcus wore a dark gray suit that emphasized his tall frame and professional bearing, and he moved through the room with quiet confidence, nodding politely to people he recognized, but avoiding the kind of glad handing that some professionals engaged in at public meetings. When our eyes met across the crowded room, Marcus's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. A brief moment of recognition, followed by what might have been surprise or concern. He made his way over to where I was sitting, extending his hand in a professional greeting that gave no indication of our previous meeting or any personal connection. "Ms. Mitchell," he said formally, "I didn't expect to see you here. Are you covering this hearing for the newspaper?" His tone was carefully neutral, the kind of polite distance that professionals maintained when they wanted to avoid any appearance of impropriety or personal relationship that might compromise their objectivity. "Yes, I'm with the Register," I replied, matching his formal tone while studying his face for any indication of his feelings about the project or the controversy surrounding it. "I understand you're the architect for the waterfront development. This is quite an ambitious project." "It is," he agreed, his expression giving nothing away about his personal investment in the outcome. "We've tried to design something that will serve the community's needs while respecting the area's historical character. Of course, public input is an important part of the process, which is why we're here tonight." Before our conversation could continue, the hearing was called to order, and Marcus took his seat with the development team at the front of the room. I settled into the press section with my notebook and recorder, preparing to document what promised to be a contentious evening of public testimony and debate. The developer's presentation lasted nearly an hour, with detailed explanations of the project's scope, timeline, and anticipated benefits for the community. Marcus's portion focused on the architectural elements, using large-scale drawings and computer-generated images to show how the new buildings would relate to existing structures and public spaces. His presentation was professional and thorough, addressing concerns about building heights, traffic flow, and visual impact with the kind of technical expertise that demonstrated deep consideration of community feedback. What struck me most about Marcus's presentation was his evident passion for the project's potential to revitalize an underused area of the city while preserving its essential character. He spoke about architecture's responsibility to serve human needs, echoing themes from our previous conversation about design's role in creating functional and beautiful communities. This wasn't just a commercial commission for him, it was an opportunity to implement his vision of how thoughtful development could enhance rather than diminish urban life. The public comment period that followed revealed the depth of community division about the project. Supporters praised the job creation and tax revenue benefits, while opponents raised concerns about affordability, parking, and the displacement of existing businesses. Several speakers questioned whether the upscale nature of the development would price out longtime residents and fundamentally change the neighborhood's character. Marcus listened intently to each speaker, taking notes and occasionally whispering with the developer about specific concerns that were raised. When a local resident challenged the height of the proposed buildings, Marcus requested permission to respond, explaining how the design team had already reduced the original heights by 2 stories based on earlier community feedback. His responses were respectful and substantive, acknowledging legitimate concerns while defending design decisions that had been made for practical or regulatory reasons. The hearing continued for nearly 3 hours, with passionate testimony from dozens of community members representing diverse perspectives on the project's merits and drawbacks. As a journalist, I found myself impressed by the quality of public engagement and the substantive nature of the debate, even when emotions ran high and disagreements became heated. This was democracy in action, messy but meaningful, with real consequences for people's lives and livelihoods. After the official proceedings concluded, I lingered in the hearing room to conduct brief interviews with key stakeholders about their reactions to the evening's testimony. Most Planning Commission members declined to comment before their formal deliberations. But several community members were willing to share their thoughts about what they had heard and how it might influence their future advocacy efforts. Marcus was gathering his materials when I approached him for a follow-up interview about the evening's proceedings. He agreed to speak briefly, though he suggested we step outside to avoid the appearance of private lobbying that might result from a lengthy conversation in the hearing room. We found a quiet spot on the front steps of City Hall, where the late summer evening provided a pleasant backdrop for our discussion. "How do you feel the hearing went tonight?" I asked, starting with a neutral question that would allow him to frame his own perspective on the community response to his project. "Better than I expected, actually," Marcus replied thoughtfully. "There were some passionate concerns raised, but most of the opposition seemed focused on legitimate planning issues rather than personal attacks or uninformed criticism. That's the kind of feedback we can work with constructively." "Several speakers mentioned affordability as a major concern," I continued. "How do you respond to worries that this development will accelerate gentrification in the waterfront area?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering his response carefully. "That's probably the most difficult aspect of any urban development project," he said finally. "We've included affordable housing units in the design, though I understand that may not fully address people's concerns about broader neighborhood changes. The reality is that leaving areas underdeveloped doesn't preserve affordability if it means people don't have good housing options or economic opportunities." His answer revealed a thoughtfulness about the social implications of his work that impressed me. Many architects I had encountered in my journalism career seemed primarily concerned with aesthetic or technical challenges, treating community concerns as obstacles to overcome rather than legitimate considerations that should influence design decisions. Marcus clearly understood that his buildings would become part of people's daily lives, with consequences that extended far beyond their visual appeal or structural integrity. "What drew you to this particular project?" I asked, genuinely curious about his motivations for taking on such a controversial commission. "The opportunity to work on something that could really transform how people experience this part of the city," he replied without hesitation. "The waterfront has incredible potential that's been underutilized for decades. Done well, this kind of mixed-use development can create vibrant public spaces that serve residents across different income levels and backgrounds. Done poorly, it becomes an isolated enclave that excludes more people than it serves." The passion in his voice was unmistakable, confirming my impression that this project represented more than just professional work for him. As we talked, I found myself increasingly curious about Marcus as a person, rather than simply as a source for my news story. His thoughtfulness and integrity stood in sharp contrast to my stepmother's calculated superficiality, making me wonder how someone like Victoria had managed to deceive him so completely. Our conversation was interrupted by Robert Chen, the developer, who approached to discuss logistics for the next phase of the approval process. I thanked Marcus for his time and prepared to return to the newspaper office to write my story about the hearing. As I walked to my car, I found myself thinking not just about the development project, but about the man who had designed it with such evident care and consideration for its impact on the community. Back at the Register, I spent the next 2 hours writing a comprehensive article about the hearing that captured the complexity of the community debate and the substantive issues raised by both supporters and opponents. I quoted Marcus's responses about affordability and community impact, presenting his perspective alongside the concerns raised by residents and business owners. Patricia reviewed my draft and praised its balance and thoroughness, noting that I had managed to explain technical planning issues in language that general readers could understand. The article was published the following morning and generated significant online discussion, with readers posting comments that continued the debate about the project's merits and drawbacks. Several people praised the newspaper's coverage for helping them understand issues they hadn't previously considered. while others used the comment section to share additional concerns or information about the development process. 3 days later, I received an email from Marcus thanking me for the fair and accurate coverage of the hearing and asking if I would be interested in touring the proposed development site to better understand the context for the architectural decisions his team had made. The invitation was clearly professional, but it represented an opportunity to learn more about urban planning and development issues that frequently appeared in my reporting assignments. I accepted the invitation, and we arranged to meet the following Saturday morning at the waterfront site. The area was indeed underutilized, consisting primarily of aging warehouse buildings and vacant lots that showed little evidence of recent investment or maintenance. Marcus arrived with rolled architectural plans and a surveyor's knowledge of the site's challenges and opportunities. As we walked through the area, Marcus explained how the existing infrastructure would be incorporated into the new design and how the project team had addressed concerns about flooding, soil conditions, and transportation access. His expertise was impressive, but what struck me more was his genuine excitement about the project's potential to create public spaces that would serve the broader community rather than just the people who could afford to live or work in the new buildings. The ground floor retail is designed to include spaces for local businesses, not just national chains, he explained as we stood on a bluff overlooking the river. We want to maintain some of the area's existing character while creating new opportunities for economic development. And the affordable housing component? I asked, remembering the concerns raised during the public hearing. 20% of the residential units will be reserved for people earning less than 80% of the area median income, Marcus replied. It's not perfect, but it's significantly more than most comparable developments include. As we continued our tour, our conversation gradually shifted from professional topics to more personal subjects. Marcus asked about my journalism career and my interest in covering local government, leading to a discussion about the role of media in helping communities make informed decisions about development and planning issues. I found myself sharing more about my background and motivations than I had intended, including my interest in stories that revealed how policy decisions affected individual people's lives. You mentioned during our interview last spring that you grew up in Millbrook, Marcus said as we concluded our tour of the development site. That's not far from where I used to live. The comment seemed casual, but something in his tone suggested deeper significance. I had been waiting for an opportunity to address the connection between us through Victoria, and this seemed like the right moment to be direct about what I knew. I'm aware that you were married to Victoria Lancaster, I said carefully, watching his reaction. She's my stepmother now. Marcus stopped walking and turned to face me fully, his expression shifting from professional politeness to something more complex and difficult to read. For several seconds, he didn't respond, apparently processing the implications of this revelation and deciding how to address it. I see, he said finally. That explains why your last name seemed familiar when we first met. I wasn't sure if there was a connection. I probably should have mentioned it earlier, I continued, but it didn't seem relevant to the professional aspects of our interactions. No, that's fine, Marcus replied, though his tone suggested the news had affected him more than his words indicated. How long have they been married? About 8 years now, I said, studying his face for any indication of his feelings about Victoria's subsequent relationships. She and my father met shortly after her first husband died. Marcus nodded slowly, and I could see him processing this information alongside whatever he knew about Victoria's pattern of relationships. The expression on his face suggested that learning about her marriage to my father had confirmed suspicions he had harbored, rather than surprising him with new information. I hope she's made your father happy, he said diplomatically, though something in his tone suggested genuine concern, rather than mere politeness. That's a complicated question, I admitted, deciding to be honest about the family dynamics that had shaped my adult life. Their marriage has been difficult for me and my younger brother. Marcus was quiet for a moment, apparently weighing whether to ask for more details or maintain the professional distance that had characterized our previous interactions. When he spoke again, his voice carried a warmth that hadn't been present in our earlier conversations. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said simply. "Blended families can be challenging under the best circumstances." The understatement was so significant that it almost made me laugh, but I appreciated his diplomatic approach to what was obviously a sensitive subject. We walked back to our cars in comfortable silence, both of us apparently processing the personal dimension that had been added to our professional relationship. Before we parted ways, Marcus surprised me by suggesting that we continue our conversation over coffee sometime, acknowledging that there might be mutual benefit in sharing perspectives about our respective experiences with Victoria. I agreed, curious about what his insights might reveal about my stepmother's behavior and motivations. We met the following week at a quiet coffee shop in downtown Eugene, far enough from both of our workplaces to ensure privacy for what might become a sensitive conversation. Marcus arrived first and had already claimed a corner table that would allow us to talk without being overheard by other customers. He stood when I entered, a gesture of politeness that reminded me how different his approach to relationships was from the casual informality I was accustomed to from people my own age. After we had ordered our drinks and settled into the comfortable chairs, Marcus began by acknowledging the unusual nature of our situation and his appreciation for my willingness to share information that might help him understand his failed marriage better. "I've spent a lot of time wondering what I missed or misunderstood about Victoria," he said honestly. "Learning about her subsequent relationships has helped me realize that the problems in our marriage weren't necessarily about my failures as a husband." I felt a surge of sympathy for this man who had clearly been hurt by Victoria's betrayal and had spent years questioning his own judgment and worthiness. His vulnerability in admitting these doubts was touching, especially given the successful and confident exterior he presented in professional settings. "From what I've observed," I said carefully, "Victoria seems to approach relationships very strategically. I don't think her decisions about marriage have much to do with the men themselves." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if my observation confirmed conclusions he had reached through his own analysis. "She left our marriage for someone she thought could provide more financial security and social status," he said matter-of-factly. "When that relationship didn't work out, she found your father. And when she gets tired of him or finds someone better, she'll probably move on again," I added, voicing a suspicion that had been growing stronger as I learned more about Victoria's romantic history. "Has she given any indication that she's unhappy with your father?" Marcus asked, genuine concern evident in his voice despite his personal history with Victoria. I spent the next hour describing the systematic way Victoria had isolated Dad from his children and longtime friends, her apparent lack of genuine emotional investment in their relationship, and her treatment of Tommy and me as obstacles to be managed rather than family members to be embraced. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally nodding in recognition of behavior patterns he had apparently observed during his own marriage. "She did something similar with my family and friends," he confirmed when I finished my account. "Not as dramatically because I didn't have children, but she gradually discouraged relationships that didn't serve her purposes or enhance her social position." "Do you think she's capable of genuine love?" I asked, curious about his perspective after 3 years of marriage to someone I had come to view as fundamentally selfish and manipulative. Marcus considered the question carefully before responding. "I think she's capable of attachment to people who meet her needs," he said finally. "But I'm not sure she understands love as most people experience it. She seemed to view our marriage as a business arrangement that should benefit both parties rather than an emotional partnership." His analysis aligned perfectly with my own. Observations about Victoria's approach to family relationships. She was dutiful about performing the role of wife and stepmother when it served her interests, but she showed no evidence of genuine affection or concern for the people in her life. Even her interactions with her own daughters seemed calculated to maintain their loyalty, rather than expressing authentic maternal love. As our conversation continued, I found myself sharing details about my family situation that I had never discussed with anyone outside of Tommy and Aunt Rebecca. Marcus was an excellent listener, asking thoughtful questions that helped me articulate feelings and observations I had struggled to express clearly. His own experience with Victoria's manipulative behavior provided validation for concerns I had sometimes worried were overreactions or misinterpretations. The hardest part, I admitted, is watching my father become someone I don't recognize. He used to be a good parent, but Victoria has convinced him that supporting her is more important than maintaining relationships with his children. She's very skilled at making people feel like their worth depends on her approval, Marcus replied with the bitter wisdom of personal experience. I found myself constantly trying to anticipate her moods and preferences, adjusting my behavior to avoid conflict rather than expressing my own needs and opinions. The parallel between his description and Dad's current behavior was striking. I had watched my father transform from a confident, independent man into someone who seemed constantly anxious about Victoria's reactions to his decisions and relationships. He had traded his authentic self for the illusion of domestic harmony, apparently unaware of how much he had sacrificed in the process. Our coffee shop conversation marked the beginning of an unlikely friendship based on our shared experience of Victoria's destructive influence and our mutual desire to understand how someone could cause so much damage to the people who tried to love her. Marcus became a valuable source of insight into the psychology of manipulation and the warning signs I might have missed if I had been older and more experienced when Victoria entered our family. Over the following months, Marcus and I met regularly, for coffee or lunch, sometimes discussing our respective experiences with Victoria, but increasingly talking about our current lives and interests. I learned that he was passionate about sustainable architecture and affordable housing development, causes that had shaped his approach to the waterfront project and many of his other professional choices. He had never remarried after his divorce from Victoria, focusing instead on building his architectural practice and contributing to community development initiatives. Marcus's perspective on relationships had been fundamentally changed by his marriage to Victoria, leaving him cautious about emotional vulnerability and skeptical of romantic partnerships that seemed to offer easy solutions to complex personal needs. His experience had taught him to value independence and authentic connection over the kind of superficial compatibility that Victoria had initially presented. As we grew closer, I began to appreciate qualities in Marcus that Victoria had apparently failed to value during their marriage. His thoughtfulness, integrity, and genuine concern for other people's well-being stood in sharp contrast to her self-centered approach to relationships. He was someone who considered the long-term consequences of his actions and took responsibility for his impact on other people's lives. Our friendship also provided me with a different perspective on my own family situation and the choices I would need to make about my relationship with Dad. Marcus helped me understand that Victoria's behavior followed predictable patterns and that her treatment of Tommy and me wasn't personal rejection, but rather strategic management of perceived threats to her control over Dad. She sees you as competition for your father's attention and resources, Marcus explained during one of our conversations. Your success and independence threaten the narrative she's created about why he needs her guidance and support. This insight helped me understand why Victoria had been so opposed to my college plans, and why she seemed relieved when Tommy moved to Seattle. Our presence in the family home had forced Dad to maintain connections to his life before Victoria. Connections that reminded him of who he had been before she began reshaping his identity and priorities. As winter approached, Marcus's waterfront development project received final approval from the City Planning Commission, though not without significant modifications that addressed community concerns about building heights and affordable housing. Percentages. The victory was bittersweet for Marcus, who was pleased about the project's approval, but frustrated by some of the compromises that had been required to satisfy political considerations rather than sound planning principles. I covered the final Planning Commission meeting for the newspaper, writing an article that traced the evolution of the project from its initial proposal through the lengthy public review process. The piece highlighted how community input had influenced the final design and how the approval represented a balance between development interests and neighborhood concerns. Patricia complimented my coverage of the complex story, noting how I had helped readers understand both the technical planning issues and the broader implications for community development. The article also marked a professional milestone for me, as it was picked up by the State Wire Service and published in several other Oregon newspapers. The recognition felt validating after months of covering routine municipal meetings and local events, confirming that I was developing the skills necessary to tackle more substantial journalism assignments. During the celebration dinner Marcus suggested to mark both his project's approval and my article's success, our conversation took a more personal turn than usual. The restaurant he had chosen was elegant but comfortable, the kind of place that encouraged lengthy conversations over multiple courses. As we discussed our respective victories, I found myself thinking about how much my life had changed since meeting him, and how his friendship had influenced my understanding of family, relationships, and personal integrity. "I want to thank you," I said as we shared dessert, "for helping me understand what happened to my family. Talking with you has helped me realize that Victoria's behavior isn't about my father's failure or our inadequacies as children." "And I want to thank you," Marcus replied, "for helping me realize that my marriage to Victoria wasn't a reflection of my shortcomings as a husband. Your perspective has helped me understand her patterns in ways I couldn't see when I was experiencing them firsthand." The mutual appreciation we expressed that evening felt like more than friendship, though neither of us explicitly acknowledged the romantic undercurrent that had been developing over months of increasingly intimate conversations. The age difference between us and the unusual circumstances of our connection made any romantic relationship seem complicated and potentially problematic. But as we said goodbye that night, Marcus's goodbye hug lasted longer than usual, and I found myself thinking about him in ways that had nothing to do with Victoria or our shared experience of her manipulation. He was an attractive, intelligent, successful man who had shown me kindness and understanding during a difficult period of my life. The fact that he was my stepmother's ex-husband seemed increasingly irrelevant compared to his qualities as a person and the genuine connection we had developed. A week later, Marcus called to invite me to accompany him to a gallery opening featuring architectural photography, an event that would clearly be a date rather than a casual meeting between friends. I accepted without hesitation, curious about where our relationship might lead and no longer concerned about the unconventional circumstances that had brought us together. The gallery opening was a sophisticated affair, attended by Eugene's architectural and artistic communities, providing an opportunity for Marcus to introduce me to colleagues and friends as his date, rather than simply as a journalist who had covered his projects. I wore a black dress that I had purchased specifically for the occasion, wanting to look appropriately elegant for the social circle I was entering. Throughout the evening, Marcus was attentive without being possessive, introducing me to interesting people and including me in conversations about art, architecture, and urban planning. His friends and colleagues were welcoming and curious about my journalism career, treating me as Marcus's equal, rather than as a young woman who was out of her depth in sophisticated company. As we walked through the gallery examining photographs of buildings from around the world, Marcus shared insights about architectural principles and design philosophies that helped me understand the artistry behind structures I might have previously viewed as merely functional. His passion for his profession was evident in every comment, and I found myself fascinated by his ability to see beauty and meaning in the built environment. The evening concluded with drinks at a wine bar near the gallery, where we continued our conversation about art and architecture while acknowledging, finally, that our relationship had evolved beyond friendship. Marcus was direct about his feelings, but also honest about his concerns regarding our unusual connection and the potential complications that might arise from dating someone related to his ex-wife. "I care about you as a person," he said simply, but I want to be sure we're both clear about what this means and whether it's something we want to pursue despite the circumstances. I appreciated his straightforward approach to a situation that could easily have become awkward or uncertain. My feelings for Marcus had developed gradually over months of getting to know him as a friend and confidant, and they were based on his character and compatibility, rather than rebellion against Victoria or curiosity about her romantic history. "I'm interested in seeing where this leads," I replied honestly, "but I think we should be prepared for some complicated reactions from other people." Marcus agreed, and we decided to continue dating while being discreet about our relationship, until we were more certain about its long-term potential. The secrecy wasn't about shame or uncertainty regarding our feelings for each other, but rather a practical recognition that our connection would generate gossip and speculation that might overshadow the genuine affection and compatibility we had discovered. Over the next several months, our relationship deepened from cautious exploration to serious romantic partnership. Marcus was unlike anyone I had dated previously, offering emotional maturity and stability that provided a welcome contrast to the uncertainty and drama that had characterized my family relationships. He was supportive of my journalism career without being patronizing, encouraging my professional ambitions while sharing his own goals and challenges. The secrecy of our relationship became increasingly difficult to maintain as we spent more time together and developed the kind of intimacy that made casual deception feel dishonest and uncomfortable. Marcus's friends and colleagues clearly knew he was seeing someone, and my co-workers at the newspaper had begun asking questions about my improved mood and busy social calendar. The situation came to a head when Patricia assigned me to cover a major story about municipal corruption that would require extensive research and investigation over several weeks. The assignment was a significant professional opportunity, but it would also require me to work closely with sources and officials who might have connections to Marcus's business or social circles. During a conversation about the potential conflicts of interest that might arise from our relationship, Marcus and I decided that we needed to be more open about our connection, at least with close friends and professional colleagues who might be affected by our involvement. The decision felt liberating, as it allowed us to stop compartmentalizing our relationship and integrate our personal and professional lives more honestly. The reactions to our relationship were mixed, but generally more positive than we had anticipated. Marcus's friends and colleagues were surprised but supportive, apparently recognizing that our connection was based on genuine compatibility rather than convenience or rebellion. My co-workers at the newspaper were curious about the unusual circumstances, but professional enough to focus on potential conflicts of interest rather than personal judgment about our choices. The one conversation we had both been avoiding was with our respective families. Marcus had maintained minimal contact with Victoria since their divorce, communicating only when legal or financial matters required direct interaction. I had been equally successful in limiting my contact with Dad and Victoria, though Tommy's situation required occasional conversations about his welfare and future plans. As our relationship became more serious, we both recognized that we would eventually need to address how our involvement might affect these already strained family dynamics. Victoria would undoubtedly view our relationship as some kind of personal attack or manipulation, while Dad might see it as evidence of my continued rejection of his choices and disrespect for his marriage. The conversation about family disclosure became urgent when I learned that Tommy was planning to visit me in Eugene during his spring break from his senior year of high school. He had been thriving under Aunt Rebecca's care in Seattle, maintaining excellent grades and developing interests in music and theater that had been discouraged during his time under Victoria's influence. His plan to visit me represented an opportunity to strengthen our relationship after years of being separated by geography and family conflict. I wanted to be honest with Tommy about my relationship with Marcus, both because I valued our close bond and because I suspected he would appreciate the irony of my involvement with Victoria's ex-husband. But I also recognized that sharing this information with him might put him in a difficult position if Dad or Victoria asked about my personal life during future conversations. Marcus suggested that we invite Tommy to have dinner with us during his visit, allowing my brother to meet him and form his own impression of our relationship without feeling like he was being asked to keep secrets or choose sides in family conflicts. The proposal felt right to me, as it would allow Tommy to understand that my relationship with Marcus was based on genuine feelings rather than revenge or rebellion. When Tommy arrived in Eugene for his spring break visit, I was struck by how much he had changed during his time in Seattle. He was taller and more confident than the anxious teenager who had left Millbrook, and his conversation revealed interests and opinions that had been suppressed during his years under Victoria's critical oversight. Aunt Rebecca's support had clearly allowed him to develop into the intelligent, thoughtful young man he had always had the potential to become. Tommy's reaction to learning about my relationship with Marcus was exactly what I had hoped for. Surprise, followed by curiosity and eventually genuine appreciation for the quality of person I had chosen to date. He spent the evening asking Marcus thoughtful questions about his work and interests, clearly evaluating him as a potential long-term partner for his sister, rather than simply as Victoria's ex-husband. "He seems like a good guy," Tommy told me, privately the next day. "Way too good for Victoria, obviously, but perfect for you. I like how he talks to you like you're an equal, and how interested he is in your work." Tommy's approval meant more to me than I had expected, confirming that my feelings for Marcus were based on sound judgment, rather than complicated emotional needs related to our family dysfunction. My brother's perspective also helped me understand that our relationship might actually represent healing rather than additional family drama, particularly if it provided both Marcus and me with the kind of genuine partnership that Victoria had been incapable of offering. During Tommy's visit, he also shared updates about Dad's situation that suggested Victoria's influence over him was continuing to deepen. Dad had recently retired from his engineering job, though he was only 62, and had been planning to work several more years. Victoria had convinced him that early retirement would allow them to travel and enjoy their financial security while they were still young enough to be active. Tommy suspected that Victoria's real motivation was to isolate Dad further from professional relationships and routines that connected him to his life before their marriage. Retirement would make him more dependent on her for social interaction and daily structure, while also providing her with greater access to his pension and retirement savings for the lifestyle improvements she constantly advocated. The information troubled me because it suggested that Victoria's control over Dad was becoming more complete, rather than loosening over time. Rather than gaining perspective on his wife's manipulative behavior as their marriage matured, Dad seemed to be becoming more thoroughly under her influence and more isolated from alternative sources of support and guidance. Tommy also revealed that Dad occasionally asked about me during their brief phone conversations, though Victoria typically interrupted or redirected these discussions before they could become meaningful exchanges of information. Dad apparently knew that I was working as a journalist in Eugene and that I was financially independent, but Victoria had successfully prevented him from learning details about my life that might inspire pride or interest in reconnecting. "Sometimes I think he wants to reach out to you," Tommy said during one of our conversations, "but he's afraid of Victoria's reaction if she finds out. It's like he's become a different person who needs permission for his own relationships." The description of Dad's current situation reinforced my appreciation for Marcus's independence and emotional maturity. Whatever mistakes Marcus had made during his marriage to Victoria, he had emerged from the experience with clearer understanding of his own needs and values, rather than becoming more dependent on external validation and control. As Tommy's visit concluded and he prepared to return to Seattle for the final months of his senior year, I found myself thinking seriously about my future in Eugene and my long-term goals for both my career and personal life. My relationship with Marcus had become the most stable and satisfying aspect of my current situation, providing emotional support and intellectual stimulation that enhanced rather than competed with my professional ambitions. Marcus had begun discussing the possibility of my meeting his extended family and longtime friends who lived in other parts of Oregon and Washington. The prospect felt like a natural progression in our relationship, though it also represented a level of commitment that would make our involvement more difficult to reverse if circumstances changed. I was also beginning to consider how my relationship with Marcus might affect my journalism career in the long term. Eugene was a relatively small city where professional and personal relationships inevitably overlapped, and dating a prominent local architect created potential conflicts of interest that might limit my ability to cover certain types of stories objectively. The limitation wasn't necessarily problematic, but it was something I needed to consider as I planned my career development. These practical considerations became more pressing when Patricia offered me a promotion to cover state government in Salem, a position that would involve significantly more responsibility and prestige, but would also require relocating to the state capital. The opportunity represented exactly the kind of career advancement I had been working toward, but accepting it would require leaving Eugene and potentially complicating my relationship with Marcus. Marcus's response to news of the job offer was typically thoughtful and supportive. He encouraged me to pursue the opportunity if it aligned with my professional goals, while also being honest about his hope that we could find a way to maintain our relationship despite the geographic distance. Salem was only an hour's drive from Eugene, making weekend visits feasible, though not ideal for developing a deeper partnership. The decision about the job offer forced me to evaluate how seriously I viewed my relationship with Marcus, and whether I was ready to make significant life choices based on romantic considerations, rather than purely professional criteria. At 25, I had always assumed that career advancement would take priority over personal relationships until I was older and more established in my profession. But my relationship with Marcus had taught me that meaningful partnerships were rare enough to warrant serious consideration when making major life decisions. His influence had helped me understand myself better and develop confidence in my judgment. That enhanced rather than undermined my professional capabilities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.